I'd like to introduce you to somebody else. I'd like to introduce you to my friend, Bob. Bob's not his real name. I asked him about whether I could share our story, and he agreed, but I told him that I'd change his name and change some of the details just to protect his privacy. But my friend Bob and I used to work together a long way back, a number of jobs ago. Bob and I were developers together. He was more on the ops side, I was more on the dev side. And it was fantastic. I really loved working with Bob because Bob is the kind of coworker that everybody wants. There are three really fantastic things about Bob. The first is that he's genuine and honest. When Bob actually says, "Hey, how's it going?" he doesn't mean that as hello. He means that as like, "How are you actually doing?" He wants a conversation with you. The second is that he's enthusiastically curious. He loves to learn about new things, whatever that new technology is. He was the first person to learn about Kubernetes, back when it was not even 1.0. He loved to just get into things. And then the third is that he's an optimistically hard worker. He really loves the idea that we can solve anything as long as we work together. So Bob was a fantastic person to work with. Eventually, we both left the company that we were working at. We both moved away, but we always stayed in touch. Bob ended up moving to another company, and I like to describe the company as essentially this meme. They really didn't understand their audience, their customers. They were constantly trying to take their product and pivot because it wasn't really resonating. And this meant that when Bob was working, they'd have him work on a task, and he'd accomplish that task, and it'd be amazing, only to suddenly be told that that's not what the company did anymore. For example, he worked on web performance for a quarter, and he managed to increase the sales for the company by simply reducing the load time for their online store. But rather than being congratulated on that for making the company millions of more dollars, he was told, that's not what you're doing now. Now you have to go do something else. This is very, very demoralizing for him. And because of that, management always thought he was working on the wrong things, and it wasn't that they were giving him the wrong instructions, it was because Bob wasn't listening, or that was their idea. And so, because they thought Bob wasn't listening to them, they decided that they were going to move him. So Bob had lived in Texas, and the company was based in Silicon Valley, so they decided that Bob could no longer be a remote worker. Bob had to move to Silicon Valley. And as anybody knows who's ever looked at housing prices and cost of living in Silicon Valley, it's ridiculously expensive. So they didn't give him a salary increase either, so Bob was losing money. He lost all of his friends. He used to play in a garage band. He used to play on a baseball team with some friends. Moved to California. Now he had no friends. He was working massive amounts of overtime because of constantly switching what he was working on. And it was really bad. He was just isolated and alone. And so Bob and I, like I mentioned, had been keeping in touch. But one day I noticed that Bob had this tweet, and he called it the CAP theorem for life. Is everybody familiar with the CAP theorem? CAP theorem in distributed systems says that you can choose consistency, availability, or partition tolerance. You can only choose two. So Bob had this idea that there's a CAP theorem for life, that you could only choose physical health, family, or work, and you could only choose two. And that's pretty fucked up, right? Like, wow, I can only be good at work and have family, but I'll be unhealthy, or yeah. So that was really messed up and not the optimistic Bob that I knew. So I gave Bob a call, and it was very obvious from the get-go on that call that Bob was actually pretty high. He had been abusing some drugs. He was in a bad state. And I didn't know what to do, right? I realized that I'm not equipped for this. Bob was completely burnt out. He was trying to cope in the best way that he knew how. But what do you do, right? Like, I'm in a different state. I'm on the phone. Do you call the cops? Like, put them on hold on the phone and, like, call for help? Do you keep them talking? Like, what do you do with this? I was completely ill-equipped. I had no idea what to do, and I was freaking out because I didn't know if Bob was going to hurt himself or what was going to happen. So quick break, what am I equipped for? As mentioned, I am a technical evangelist at Datadog. I'm also a collector of various things. I'm a nomad, so I travel around a lot. I've been living in about one city every week since February, so currently Montreal is my home. Next week, Portland will be my home. I also do like whiskey. That's my favorite whiskey up there. Side note, though, I like whiskey. I enjoy it for the flavors. Do not self-medicate. If you are also into drinks, beer, or whatever, but you find that you're partaking a little too much because of having to deal with stress and burnout, seek some help. The other thing that I do is I play a lot of Pokemon. So even though this is my first time to Montreal, if you find me wandering around later, I'm not lost. I'm probably just trying to catch something. If you do play Pokemon Go, hit me up later. That's my friend code. I can send you fun things from around the world. A little bit about Datadog, because they are my employer and they do help fund my travels around the world. Datadog is a SaaS-based monitoring platform, so we do your traditional infrastructure and application metrics. We do APM, or distributed tracing, and we also do logs, so log analytics. So you get those three pillars of observability all in one product. We do handle trillions of points of data every day, so we operate at massive scale, and we are hiring. So if you're looking to work and build fantastic tools for other engineers, for other software developers that make their lives easier, we'd love to have you join our team. We do hire remotely for some positions, so you can stay here in Montreal, or you can maybe live wherever. Also, if you're dealing with an environment that you're burning out in, Datadog does have a fantastic environment where we try not to burn people out, and we ensure that they're having a fantastic work environment. So I've titled this Burnout Community Problem, Community Solution, because I think that all of us at some point will inevitably face a similar situation to what I had. Burnout is common within our industry. So it's likely that you will encounter a colleague or a friend who is dealing with some burnout, and hopefully my goal is that you will be much more prepared than I was. So let's discuss, is this really a community problem? Do we have a problem with burnout in tech? GFI did a study that they surveyed a bunch of people in IT operations, and they found that 40% of the respondents regularly lost sleep due to the stress of work. And this isn't counting being on call. This isn't because they were staying up at night because they were on pager duty. This is simply from the stress of the work that we do. They found that 50% of people worked between 8 to 20 hours of overtime. Now, they didn't define this as saying, anything over 40 hours. This is simply saying you define, are you working overtime? And 50% of people that responded. 82% of people have considered leaving technology due to the stress they experience on the job, which is a fantastic number. And a bunch of these people, about a quarter of the people, actually consider it on a regular basis. So unfortunately, this study was just for the US, but I don't know. Those of us south of the border always look up and think that Canada is so much better. You have nationalized healthcare and all these amazing things. So is Canada actually better? Well, not really, actually. 25% of Canadian workers report that they have high daily stress. So every day that they go to work, they have high stress. The stat about overtime. So in the US, it was about 50% on average worked 8 to 20 hours of overtime. Study done up here in Canada. Apparently, you Quebecois work really, really hard because 64% of you work overtime, which is a lot, right? That's far more than half. So if we want to define whether this is a community problem, whether stress and burnout is a problem, then I think this is clearly yes, right? If we take that number of 82% of you in this room have considered leaving tech because of the stress, that's a problem. So let's talk about some community solutions. Well, the first is burnout. First solution to burnout is DevOps. And I'm not going to dive too much into this because John Willis, who is one of the founders of DevOps Days, has a fantastic talk about burnout. and how DevOps and bringing together development and operations and aligning groups within an organization helps resolve a lot of the environmental issues that lead to burnout. These slides will be available later as well, so you don't have to take photos of these URLs. The second, though, is self-care. So obviously, taking care of ourselves is very, very important. Ken Mugrage, who also is heavily involved in the DevOps Days organization, he's on the global team, gave a talk at DevOps Days Portland a couple years ago about how to take care of yourself. And to dive a little bit into what he talked about, he identified the 6 mismatches from Christina Maslach, who's one of the foremost researchers in Burnout. And those mismatches are essentially where you are not in alignment with where you ought to be. And so the first is work overload. And I think this is very obvious. We know that burnout is caused by overwork and working too much. If I think back about Bob, this is very obvious, right? When a company is constantly pivoting and telling you to work on something new, something different, and throwing away your work, you're going to be working a lot of overtime. The second, though, is a lack of control. And it's that idea that you need to have some input into what you're working on and what you're doing. And so this is obviously a thing where DevOps helps with that, right? If you have DevOps, if you have better alignment, hopefully you will not be working on things that don't matter. When I think about Bob, again, it comes down to that pivoting, though. He had no control over what he was working on. The third is insufficient rewards. So as we start to think about how we can be better as a community, be better as teammates and colleagues to those other people on our teams who might be burning out, insufficient rewards is a big one. You don't have to be a manager. Insufficient rewards could be financial. It could be like Bob, where he wasn't getting raises, he wasn't getting a cost of living compensation. But it could be as small as being a good teammate and giving verbal recognition to your teammates, right? When somebody does good work, identify that. Tell them that they did a good job. Share that with others, particularly if you have a manager that isn't actually recognizing that. The fourth is a breakdown of workplace community, or sometimes project community, for those who work on open source projects outside of work. But really, what it comes down to is, are you hanging out with people at work? You know, you don't always have to go out to happy hour with your coworkers. I understand that after a day is done, you might want to go home. But take some time. Go out to lunch with your coworkers. Try to build better connections with them. With Bob, this was very obvious. When they moved him from Texas to California, he had no friends. He didn't know anybody in the office in California. He had no community. One of the things that I like to point out to the people who are looking for jobs, as mentioned, there's a job board over there. But if you're looking for jobs, and whenever you get interviewed, they always ask you, do you have any questions for us? If you're talking to a company, ask them, how do people have fun? What do they do after work? Do people hang out? If they're not hanging out, if they're not having fun, that's a red flag. You might not want to work there. The fifth is an absence of fairness. For Bob, this was obvious. He was the only remote worker that was forced to move, right? They weren't ending remote work. But fairness is a value. You want to know that you're being treated fairly amongst your peers. And the sixth is a values conflict. So obviously, you don't want to work for a company that's building a product that you hate or doing some sort of service that you think is antithetical to your beliefs. But it could be small things, right? You want to have that values alignment. The things that you work on, you want to know that you're contributing to the company, and the company is something that you believe in. The interesting thing about this is that Google had this study about what makes successful teams. And they thought, well, what makes a successful team is you should have a cross-functional team, right? That's one of the things that we talk about in DevOps. You should have a team that has an ops person and a developer and a QA person and all the right components, right? And just like Voltron, these 5 mini lion robots form one big lion robot, and it all works together perfectly, right? Surprisingly, they found that that wasn't the case. It didn't matter what people they had on a team. The successful teams followed this, that first they had psychological safety, that people were comfortable working in this team and felt safe working in that team, and that their teammates were dependable, that there was structure and clarity behind what they were doing, that they knew how they all fit together, that they had meaning in their work, that what they were working on they felt was valuable, that it wasn't just going to be thrown away, and that they were making an impact. And surprisingly, all of these sort of line up with those 6 mismatches, right? We can start to see that, having a lot of these components really does deal with burnout. So the first 2, again, implementing DevOps to correct some of the toxic environments that lead to burnout, equipping ourselves to take care of ourselves, self-care is very important. But I want to talk about equipping ourselves to help others, right? Because the fact is, even though burnout may be less than a majority, even if it's 1 in 10, if we drive that number down and say that only 1 in 10 people will ever experience burnout or have high stress in their work, well, if you're on a team of 10, that means 9 more people will be exposed to that person. So I think we all need to really equip ourselves. And the first way that we do is that we have to recognize what burnout looks like. So Christina Maslach, who came up with those 6 mismatches, also came out with what's called the Maslach Burnout Inventory. And this is a way that we can identify people that have burnout. And the first characteristic that she noted is that people will be exhausted. They'll just be tired. And I think we've all experienced this. When we see someone with burnout, when we've had burnout ourselves, you're just always tired. The second that she notes is cynicism, that people get a negative perspective on life. And I noticed this with my friend Bob, right? He was always optimistic, but then he came up with this really bad cap theorem for life, became very cynical. And the third is a lack of efficacy. People that are burnt out generally do not feel like they're contributing. They feel like they're not efficient, they're not being productive. So those are some good ideas, but I feel like they're a little bit hard, right? Because you can't read somebody else's mind. You don't know whether they're feeling effective or not. And cynicism may not play out. It may be hard to tell when someone's getting negative, particularly if they're always a cynical person anyway. So a different method to discovering whether somebody's burnt out is called the SMBM. It's another inventory indicator, but they talk about physical fatigue. So again, sort of that idea of exhaustion when someone's physically tired. But they, rather than cynicism, say emotional exhaustion. And I really like this because emotional exhaustion can really be not so much cynicism, but maybe apathy. How many of us, when you start to get burnt out or when you get stressed, not feeling good in a workplace, it's not that you get negative, you just don't care anymore, right? Just fuck it, like, who cares? I'm just going to sit there. And the last is cognitive weariness. Cognitive weariness is the idea that when you ask someone a question, if it takes them a bunch of time to answer that question, where you think that maybe they should have been faster at it, or maybe they're just a bit slower on the uptake. So it's easier to spot this than to know if somebody's feeling less efficient. But I think ultimately the third way that you don't need these actual scientific indicators, you don't need to run tests on people. It's really just to be connected. Right? My friend Frank has this idea that he calls 3 a.m. friends, and I love this. 3 a.m. friends is this rule that says you should be able to call 3 friends at 3 a.m. to bail you out of a problem. And if you can, then you're connected. Similarly, you should have 3 friends that could call you at 3 a.m. To help them. Now, he's not saying that we should implement pager duty and have on-call rotations for our friends. But he is saying that you should have that connection, right? You should have some people that really, honestly know you well enough and care about you that at 3 a.m. you could give them a call and they'd help you out. So that honestly is the best way to know if someone's burnt out, is that you'll know. Simply, you will know from being connected, because usually when you're connected, those people will tell you. They'll tell you, hey, work sucks. I'm getting burnt out. Now, when I say you'll know, you're not trained in medical or mental health. So how do you know? Well, you could be wrong, to be honest. Burnout and depression are very, very similar, and that's one way that you can be wrong. But they did studies. Burnout. They had a bunch of people that were burnt out. They did a study. They actually ran them through some of the diagnosing to see if they had depression. And surprisingly, 86% of people that were diagnosed with burnout actually met the criteria for being depressed. But the fantastic thing is, even if we don't know, even if we think someone's burnt out and they're actually dealing with medically defined depression, the answers are all the same. So when we equip ourselves not just for burnout, but we can equip ourselves for really every sort of mental health crisis. The way that we do that is mental health first aid. There's a fantastic organization. They're global, but this is the one for Canada, MHFA, mentalhealthfirstaid.ca. And if you were to take this course, and it is available all across Canada, they teach classes here in Montreal. They're a little bit expensive, but if that's a hindrance for you, talk to me. I'm happy to pay for it. We need more people trained. But the quick rundown, in case you don't, is to remember ALGIE. ALGIE is this koala because mental health first aid came from Australia. But ALGIE is an acronym. Unfortunately, they aren't tech people, so it's not self-recursive. The A in ALGIE doesn't stand for algae, which is a little disappointing. But the A is for assess for risks of suicide or harm. Right? We're going to triage people just like we triage technical incidents. And the first is to assess. Right? Simply put, you need to figure out if somebody is at risk of hurting themselves or hurting others. And the best way to do this, just like in technical incident, is to ask. Now, I know that's scary, right? It's really scary to go up to your friend and say, hey, man, I think you're burnt out. You thinking of committing suicide? Like, that's a scary thing to ask. And I know a lot of people feel like maybe that's a bad idea. Maybe I'll plant that idea in their head if they hadn't thought of it. And that's actually a myth. You will not plant that idea in somebody's head. You will not encourage them to commit suicide. But you need to know. You need to ask that. If they say yes, you can follow up, right? It's not just leaving it there, but don't be afraid to ask. The number one problem is if you don't ask and someone ends up harming themselves. Fantastic people around, though, that can help with this, right? If you do ask and someone is saying, yeah, they've thought about it, there are numbers that you can call. There are a lot of people that can offer help. So here in Quebec, that's the number that you can call. Nationally, across Canada, there's this other number. There are resources available that can help you out. Simple as saying, hey, man, you're in a bad spot. I don't necessarily know how to help you, but I do know people who can. Let's three-way call with them. Let's get on the phone with them. The L in ALGIE is to listen non-judgmentally, right? Take some time, listen to what your friend is saying. Try to understand their situation. Just listen, just be there. The number one issue with people that are burnt out, that are dealing with issues, is that they feel disconnected. Just being there and listening helps with that. The G in ALGIE is to give reassurance and information. Give reassurance. There are tons of people, as mentioned from the statistics, that are overworked, that are facing stress, that are getting burnt out. You're not alone. The other reassurance is burnout isn't your fault. Burnout isn't an issue that you are self-deficient, that you can't handle this. Burnout is an issue of environmental factors, as mentioned. It's issues that DevOps can deal with. So it's a product of environments, not of people. So give them that reassurance, and then give them information. The E in ALGIE is to encourage appropriate professional help. So this is some of the information that you want to give them. Who can they turn to actually get help? And there's a lot of great resources out there. 211, which is run by the United Way, has thankfully spread to a large part of Canada. So it's available in roughly 50% of Quebec. There's also OSMI, which is the Open Sourcing Mental Illness Project. It's particularly driven around technology, so it's suited to all of us here in this room, of how we can combine both the passion that we have for working on tech, which sometimes drives us to working those long hours, but how we can actually combine those and get resources. And then there's the Canadian Mental Health Association. So there's the URLs for both the national and the provincial group. The final E in algae is to encourage self-help or other support strategies. Really, how can we help ourselves? And there's a number of also great resources. Burnout.io is another technology-oriented website where it helps tech workers like us figure out ways that we can start to manage some of the stresses that we have in our daily jobs. Mood Gym is another one from Australia, actually scientifically backed. It started as a research project, but really it's just an online way to do mindfulness-based cognitive therapy. So get people in touch with what they're feeling, analyzing the environmental factors that are influencing your burnout and how to deal with those. So just to recap, algae, assess for risk of suicide or harm. Just be honest with people. Be connected. When you're connected, it becomes easier to ask the questions. Listen non-judgmentally. Give reassurance and information. Encourage professional help, and then encourage that self-help. So back to the call that I had with Bob. Surprisingly, without knowing it, I'd managed to do a lot of this. Thankfully, I was at home when I was on the call, so quickly opened my laptop, Googled the drug that he said he was taking. It's not great. You shouldn't abuse drugs, but on the spectrum of mild to really dangerous, it was fairly mild. So I knew he was generally going to be okay health-wise. He was in his car, just pulled off to the side of the road, told him to stay there, and we ended up just talking. We talked for several hours that night until he started to sound a bit more coherent. The drugs had started to fade a bit, and I thought he was safe. A few weeks later, I ended up going down to California. I visited with him. He wasn't in great shape, but he was doing a little bit better. Turns out that the company actually laid him off or fired him, depending on which perspective you take, which actually was a fantastic turn of events for him, even though being laid off or being fired is always stressful in and of itself. It got him out of that toxic environment. But yeah, without knowing it, I managed to do it. The nice thing about algae is it's not rocket science. It's not something that's really complex. It really is about being connected, listening to people, finding them resources. So just to recap for those solutions, spread DevOps. Everything that you learn here, everything that you learn about fixing environments, getting people aligned, getting people participating and contributing to the overall team within your organization. That's the #1 way to help fight burnout, is to fix those environments that lead to it. But the second two, start to take some time to invest in yourself to reduce the burnout and reduce the stresses in your own life. And then equip yourself, because we're going to need a lot more people to have at least some small training to help out. And with that, I think, do I have time for questions? I do have time for questions. I'm getting nods. Sweet. Side note, I am not a mental health professional. I have obviously been trained in mental health first aid. But yeah, happy to take any questions. Also, the slides are there. DOD, YUL. YUL because I'm a travel nerd and I like airport codes, so sorry it's not MTL. But yeah, happy to take any questions if there are any.